But these prompts are quite a bit different than ones you've probably experienced in the past. Here, each prompt will have fixed instructions and input data. The instructions are fixed. They do not change. The idea is that we could vary the input data or create different instantiations of it to create different versions of this prompt. Now, our goal is to create runnable prompt instantiations. Runnable meaning it is ready to be submitted to an LLM. Now, we're not creating templates. The basic idea between a template and an instantiation is that the template wouldn't have the data. It is absolutely essential that we're able to demonstrate to the client not only are we able to design prompts that can be used to create many different iterations of it, but also that we can instantiate the data in a very realistic manner. So that's the general, very broad sort of description of what the prompts are supposed to look like. There's fixed instructions and input data. Now, the rest of this document isn't a step-by-step tutorial about how to write those prompts. It's a relatively dense list of criteria that each prompt has to satisfy. So I'm going to work through the list. I'm not going to cover everything in great detail. I think it's probably appropriate just to point out some of the common issues that I see when people first try and create prompts in this project. So when you get ready to start, the first thing you're going to do is select a domain and a subdomain. That's the second tab in this list here. I strongly recommend that you draw on your background and you're creating prompts that really rely heavily on your past experience. It's almost impossible to write very, very realistic prompts in this project without having a deep, deep understanding of the subject material. If you're going to include any background information or persona in the prompt, there's a few things you got to keep in mind. The first is that we shouldn't be using first-person language. So never say, I'm, for example, a finance expert and I need your help doing ... It's perfectly fine, and in a lot of cases, very realistic to inform the model of the context that you're discussing, but just don't do it in first person. So instead, you could be like, you could tell the model, say, you are a finance expert and you are doing ... Just don't use first-person language. Also, if you're going to include any additional information like that, just make sure that it's not niche, because these prompts have to be iterated thousands of times, but also that it's actually relevant. A lot of the cases you can pull out this extra commentary and the prompt still stands alone. It's not actually needed in order to execute the prompt. Now, the biggest mistake we see with the input data is that it is not long enough. There isn't a strict requirement of a minimum length of the data, but all I can tell you is that it has to be long and it has to be complex. And what that means is really just depends on the domain. But I can tell you that if you ask a very realistic prompt, and it is realistic that the input data is relatively short, then that's not suitable for this project. It is a requirement that the input data is extremely complex and long. So I would advise you just to have a look at the prompt examples to get a feeling for some of the stuff that the client has accepted up to this point. Because there are no strict criteria for this, except for the relatively obscure criteria that it has to be long and complex. In addition to that, the realism of the data is absolutely essential. So my advice is to first determine who is doing this task, in the professional domain, and what format would they be receiving the data in. Now, a lot of the times the answer would be a PDF. That might be realistic, but no attachments are allowed here, so it makes the prompt not suitable for this project. So you're gonna have to find long, complex, realistic data that you can include in text format. So it has to be, the data is included in the prompt, as you can see from the examples. Besides that, probably the most important thing to mention is that there can be zero evidence that an LLM was used. That's instant rejection. So it is totally your responsibility from start to finish to make sure that no claim can be made that an LLM was used. That means even if your formatting looks like an LLM could have made it, that makes it inappropriate. It is up to you to make sure that it does not, there's zero indication that an LLM was used. Now, in terms of complexity, this, along with many of the constraints here, there's a lot of gray area. So to put it in very broad terms, these prompts have to be complex. There's not some magic evaluation project that we can provide to say when it's complex enough or not, but it's your responsibility to be able to defend that the prompt is indeed complex. Now, when you're thinking about complexity in terms of models, reasoning, synthesis, and evaluation are all very good domains or areas you can look at for it to be a complex prompt. Models they're getting pretty good at being able to do straightforward analysis, but if you have a multi-step problem that requires generating anything or reasoning through certain steps, then typically this becomes a complex ask for the model. A quite important point is to avoid decomposability. So your prompt should not, even if the analysis step is complicated, you should not be just doing the same thing to every data row over and over and over. You should be using the data set as a whole, even though you might have to parse in every data row individually. You're using all of that information to do a task. You're not just repeating the same task over and over, even if that task is complex. That's referred to as, the task would then be referred to as being decomposable. So keep that in mind. As far as the output, once these prompts are done, they're going to be submitted to two different models, and then you're going to have to preference rank them. So you're going to have to say which response you prefer over the other, and then provide a detailed justification of why that's the case. So to that end, you need to start thinking about that while you're writing the prompt. Now, the egregious example, and this might apply to a lot of people here. If your prompt has a single, for example, equation, that's the output, that's the answer, that's great for a stumping project. That is terrible here, because you've just provided the model with lines and lines and lines of data. If it results in some number, either that number is correct or not, and you're unlikely to be able to verify if it's correct or not. So you don't want to think about, even if it was a table of numbers, that's going to be extremely difficult to preference rank. So in addition to these objectively verifiable components, we encourage you to add in subjective parts to the solution, to the output. That way, doing the preference ranking is much more feasible in terms of, is this explanation, the model that was provided by the model, is that helpful? Is that helpful to an expert in that domain? But there can be a lot of subtleties involved with that. So read this section through. It's pretty dense, but it's important to try and incorporate both objective and subjective components to the prompt. Now, the questions you're asking have to be they have to be feasible without the use of like doing internet searches or writing code and executing the code. It should be, that's, I'm always going to say prioritize reasoning-based tasks over like strict calculations. That is both a client request, but also going back to the preference ranking side of things, it does not you no good to ask a super complicated question about a series of calculations because you have no way of providing defensible justifications about why you prefer one model over the other. So stick to reasoning-based asks. There's a lot of different ways you can do that. There's a lot of creativity that comes into this project. Again, just have a peek at the examples to get an idea of what's been done. But by no means are these examples some sort of template that you have to emulate. In fact, if you do, it's going to be painfully obvious and it's going to be rejected because every prompt has to be totally different. You can't look at the template or an example and then try and copy that. That's totally inappropriate. Now, this last section of the guidelines is essentially, I encourage you to run the prompt for two different reasons. The first is that it will provide you the output. And then at that point, imagine you're trying to preference rank it. Is it suitable for preference ranking, or is it 5 pages of numbers that would be so impossible to evaluate unless you had a day to actually go through and do the analysis? The other reason is that, and I don't believe I mentioned this before, the complexity of these prompts should be that we would expect a model to fail. We're not requiring that, but it should be painfully obvious that this is a complex task that the model will have trouble doing. Now, to that end, if you run it, you should be able to point to a few areas of the output and be like, yeah, this isn't ideal. So if you run your prompts after you come up with an idea, you can make sure it's suitable for preference ranking and it's also sufficiently complex. Now, all of these criteria, and I only mentioned a few of them, I've essentially summarized into different ways of reading through this information, presenting it from another angle. So the first would be a rubric. Each point evaluates the true or false. The goal would be that your prompt, each of these criteria would evaluate the true for every prompt. So it's not okay to pick 3 out of the 18. Your prompts are expected to satisfy every one of these criteria. To make that even easier, we've again rephrased the requirements in the form of a checklist. So my advice is to read through this whole document to start. It's very dense, so it's going to be hard to totally absorb all that. But once you've gone through and you've written your first draft of your prompt, go through the checklist and make sure that it's satisfying everything. There's no doubt going to be something that you haven't really been thinking about. So this first pass will get the creative juices flowing and be like, oh yeah, I don't have anything subjective in my question. I need to go and modify that. So you can either do that using the checklist or the rubric. I mean, realistically, it's the same criteria just phrased in different ways. So that's it in terms of like explicit instructions. There's a general format for what these prompts look like. They have to be prompt instantiations. There's some very broad overarching themes in that it has to be complex. It has to be extremely realistic. Everything included has to be relevant. There can be no extra information that it just doesn't need to be included in the prompt. But beyond that, it's trying to satisfy all these criteria. And this is a difficult ask. Having said that, once you do internalize all these requirements, the project really isn't that bad. So there's a steep learning curve here, but once you're able to absorb it and start cranking out useful content, it will become easier and easier. To that end, I've also included some preference labeling instructions. How to read through this. If you've been part of preference ranking before, it's fairly similar to other projects. There's no big curveballs here. The justifications for which model you choose need to be backed up by solid discussion points. Saying you like the left version better than the right because the formatting is better. I mean, it's conceivable that would happen, but that's not the sort of thing that the client is looking for here. Really, if it boils down to a bullet list formatting, then your prompt wasn't written correctly. So you should have a very good expectation about what you're going to focus in on your preference ranking while you're writing the prompt. So even if you're not at the stage of doing the preference ranking yet, please read through this because that will help align you to the project goals before you even put pen to paper. And then, yes, we have, actually, for a project, this is a great starting point. We have 15 prompts that are accepted by the client. So again, if you copy the example here, it's just going to be rejected. These all have to be novel prompts. These are just examples of what the client does like in terms of complexity, realism, the sorts of asks. So I strongly encourage you to read through. And in particular, look at the input data. Like the input data here is it's quite extensive. So other than that, yeah, we'll be available on the chat to clarify some of these points because I'm sure there will be questions that pop up. But my hope is that this instruction document can get everyone aligned and starting to create some content here. Thank you for your time.